12-year-old Jameer Washington stood on the edge of the airport's private hangar zone, holding his school-issued tablet with steady hands. He wasn't doing anything illegal, just filming different models of aircraft for a middle school STEM competition. He had a soft spot for cargo planes, especially older models, and the ones parked here were rare. The light breeze ruffled his hoodie, and the afternoon sun reflected off the polished metal fuselages like mirrors in the sky. He zoomed in slowly, narrating softly for the video. This was his passion, and he'd even skipped a birthday party to be here. He was focused, obsessed even. Captain Don Harkness, a senior pilot for CalStar Airways, noticed the boy from across the tarmac. He didn't like what he saw. A kid standing alone near the restricted side gate. Not wearing a badge. Not in uniform. And black. That last part wasn't said aloud, but it lived between Don's tightly drawn brows and the way he immediately reached for his airport-issued radio. He didn't walk over. He didn't ask questions. He called security. Suspicious minor near Hangar B, unattended. Possibly trying to access restricted area, he reported tersely. His voice was flat, professional, just enough concern to trigger action but not enough to warrant skepticism. Protocol kicked in. Within minutes, airport police rolled in. 2 officers, fast, silent, their cruiser tires screeching across the concrete. Lights but no sirens. Their weapons weren't drawn, but their hands hovered near holsters. Jameer looked up, confused, then alarmed as one officer advanced quickly. "Put it down," the taller one barked, pointing at the tablet. Jameer froze. "I said put it down." He dropped the device gently. It cracked against the pavement. The second officer grabbed his wrist, spun him around, and cuffed him. Jameer's knees buckled from fear. He stammered, trying to explain he was just working on a project, that his father knew he was here, that he wasn't trespassing. But no one was listening. The boy's voice disappeared behind the cold click of handcuffs and the squawk of a walkie-talkie. Inside the terminal, a woman who worked as a flight coordinator watched in stunned silence. She knew that boy. He'd been coming to the airport every Saturday for months with his dad. Always respectful. Always excited about planes. She ran out toward the scene, waving her badge, shouting that this was a misunderstanding. It didn't matter. By the time she reached them, Jameer was in the back of the cruiser, head down, shaking. The officers told her they were just following up on a call. That they'd sort it out once backup arrived. Backup? The call went out again, this time to airport management. And then, to someone higher. A matte black SUV pulled up on the far side of the lot. No logos. No government seal. Just tinted windows and quiet authority. The back door opened slowly, and out stepped Dr. Marcus Redding. He was calm, collected. Wore a tailored navy suit, subtle gold cufflinks, and aviator sunglasses that reflected the chaos ahead. His walk was measured, controlled. He approached the scene without introducing himself. He asked the officer for his badge number. Then the second officer. Then he turned to Jameer, still in cuffs, and calmly asked if he was okay. "Dad," Jameer croaked. His voice cracked like glass. Marcus looked at the taller officer. "Release him. Now." "Sir, we have." "You don't," Marcus cut in. "You have nothing. Except a civil rights violation and a lawsuit on your hands." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. After a long pause, they uncuffed Jameer. The boy rubbed his wrists, picked up his cracked tablet from the ground, and stepped behind his father. Marcus turned toward the growing crowd. The terminal manager had come out, trying to apologize. The pilot who had made the call, Don Harkness, stood stiffly nearby, watching as the situation spiraled beyond his intent. "Who called this in?" Marcus asked, his voice low but piercing. Harkness raised his hand halfway. "I just saw something off, thought it might be a security risk." Marcus stepped forward, handing over his ID, an embossed federal badge with gold lettering. Federal Aviation Administration, Administrator. the highest civilian authority in aviation. Your judgment, Captain Harkness, triggered a rapid police response on a 12-year-old with a school tablet. A boy you didn't speak to, didn't question. You assumed danger. Why? Don blinked. Sir, I was following protocol. No. You were following bias. And this isn't protocol. It's profiling. The pilot stammered, trying to defend himself. Marcus didn't let him finish. You know how many black pilots there are in your airline's senior command? 1. Out of 345 captains. 1. Someone behind them was filming now. Airport employees had started whispering. The mood had changed. Harkness looked around, suddenly aware that he was no longer in control of the situation. Marcus knelt beside Jameer and checked his wrists. The red marks were fading, but the boy's face was pale. He hadn't cried yet. The SUV door opened again. A staffer walked up and whispered in Marcus's ear. Press is calling. NAACP wants a statement. Senate committee staffers asking if this delays the Monday oversight hearing. Marcus stood slowly. Looked at the officers, then at Harkness, then at the terminal manager. No. This doesn't delay anything, he said. This becomes part of it. The air seemed to thin. I'll need all security footage, Marcus added. Body cam footage from both officers. Dispatch audio logs. Terminal cam. My legal office will coordinate with your administration. I'll expect it by end of day. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He guided Jameer into the SUV, leaving the officers stunned, the pilot flushed, and the airport staff in quiet shock. Inside the vehicle, Jameer leaned back, finally letting out a deep breath. I didn't do anything, Dad. I was just filming. For school. I told them. I know, Marcus said softly. And you shouldn't have to explain that to people with guns. As the car pulled away, Marcus tapped open his phone. A new file was already forming. Timestamps, locations, footage. He wasn't just a father. He was the gatekeeper of the skies. And now, he had proof. This wouldn't be another private apology. It wouldn't disappear behind internal memos. This time, the sky was going to listen. The next morning, headlines exploded across national media. Social platforms buzzed with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #GroundedAssumptions. The short, blurry footage captured by an airport employee showed just enough. A child in handcuffs, a calm black man showing a federal badge, and a visibly shaken pilot frozen in place. Commentary poured in from all sides. Some accused the police of overreach. Others defended the pilot, claiming he acted on instinct. But most couldn't ignore the optics. Another black child treated as a threat, until authority in a suit changed the narrative. Inside FAA headquarters in D.C., Marcus Redding reviewed the surveillance files from the airport. He didn't flinch as the footage replayed Jameer being grabbed, spun, cuffed. He'd seen worse. But this wasn't just about his son. This was systemic. Woven into the very fabric of an industry that touted precision, professionalism, and equity, but rarely held its people accountable. His assistant entered briskly. Sir, you're scheduled to speak at the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Oversight in 2 hours. They added bias in aviation policy to the agenda. Marcus nodded. Move the bodycam footage to the front of my presentation. No edits. There were murmurs that Marcus was overstepping, that this was a personal vendetta. But they underestimated him. They thought he'd be a silent administrator content to oversee spreadsheets and flight safety charts, not someone who would challenge the very pilots and policies he was appointed to regulate. On Capitol Hill, cameras flashed as he entered the hearing chamber. Senators from both parties leaned in. Some had already seen the footage. Some hadn't. But they all understood something big was coming. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus didn't waste a second. He skipped the pleasantries and played the clip. Silence gripped the room as the video played out, Jameer's fear, the officer's aggression, the cold efficiency of how quickly assumptions turned into handcuffs. When the video ended, Marcus faced the panel. That child is my son. But if he weren't, if I hadn't shown up, what would have happened next? Would we be sitting here discussing a tragedy instead of a policy failure? A few senators shifted uncomfortably. Marcus continued. This is not about one bad pilot or two misguided officers. This is about a pattern of institutional decisions that continue to define black youth as threats and black professionals as anomalies. In aviation, an industry responsible for moving millions daily, we cannot afford these patterns. Not morally. Not legally. He outlined data. Minority applicants rejected from flight schools at double the rate of white applicants, promotion rates skewed toward white pilots, and security protocols that relied on discretion, often subjective and tainted by unconscious bias. One senator, a known skeptic, leaned into the mic with respect. Administrator Redding, you're making serious accusations. Are you suggesting commercial pilots receive no bias training? Marcus didn't blink. I'm stating a fact. Most airlines provide a single, optional 2-hour session during onboarding. That's not training. That's a checkbox. The senator tried to pivot. But in this case, the pilot reported what he perceived as a potential threat. Isn't that what we want? Marcus nodded slowly. Perception isn't inherently racist. But when perception is shaped by years of implicit bias, it becomes dangerous. We've trained pilots to recognize mechanical failures in seconds, but not to examine their own assumptions before calling police on a child with a tablet. A moment of stillness followed. Marcus placed a printed report on the desk. Here's a proposal. Mandatory annual anti-bias certification for all commercial pilots and security personnel. Transparent reporting of bias incidents within airport. And disciplinary protocols for false security escalations. Some senators murmured approval. Others scribbled note. The media outside would eat it up. But inside, the weight of reform was just beginning. After the hearing, Marcus returned to his office. The work didn't stop with a speech. He met with airline executives via secure conference call. The CEO of Kelstar Airways joined reluctantly, visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Redding, the CEO began, I want to sincerely apologize on behalf of Kelstar. We've placed Captain Harkness on leave pending investigation. Marcus didn't acknowledge the apology. I don't need gestures. I need transformation. This incident can't end with disciplinary leave. What's your current breakdown of black pilots in your fleet? The CEO hesitated. Less than 3%. And senior command? Under 1%. Then this is a systemic failure, not a personnel issue. He made his position clear. If Kelstar wanted to retain FAA partnership benefits, they needed to submit a diversity audit within 30 days, along with a reform plan. The message was direct: change or face consequences. In the following days, pilot forums lit up. Some claimed they were being scapegoated. Others defended Harkness, insisting he wasn't racist, just cautious. But a quiet group of pilots, including several black veterans, began speaking out. One even posted a video recounting how he'd been followed through terminals in uniform. Another described being mistaken for a baggage handler while in his captain's jacket. Jameer, meanwhile, stayed home from school. The incident had gone viral, and his classmates asked too many questions. His teacher sent letters of support. A local aviation museum offered him a private tour. But the tablet was still broken, and he hadn't touched his school project since the arrest. One evening, Marcus knocked on his son's door. Can I come in? Jameer nodded. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed. I'm sorry that happened to you. I didn't protect you the way I should have. Jameer looked up. But you fixed it. Marcus shook his head. Not yet. But I will. He pulled out a replacement tablet, sleeker and faster than the last. You still want to finish the project? Jameer nodded slowly. There's a whole world of aircraft out there waiting for your lens, Marcus said. And you've got the best eye I've ever seen. Jameer smiled, just a little. It was the first one since the airport. Marcus stood. When you're ready, we'll film again. But next time, we'll go through the front gate. And they'll know your name before we get there. Jameer's voice was quiet but steady. They already do. Outside, the news kept rolling and debates continued. But inside the Washington home, a small moment of restoration passed between a father and son. No headlines. No speeches. Just healing. One frame at a time. Marcus didn't stop with speeches or executive pressure. He knew systemic problems demanded systemic responses. Within a week, he convened a task force at the FAA made up of pilots, airport security experts, aviation psychologists, and civil rights advocates. The mission was explicit: identify how bias operated in aviation, not just in hiring, but in daily assumptions and protocol enforcement, and create reforms with enforcement teeth. The first report that crossed his desk revealed an uncomfortable truth. In the past 5 years, over 1,200 reports were filed against passengers of color being wrongfully detained or profiled at major U.S. airports. Fewer than a dozen of those cases had resulted in formal reviews. None led to penalties. Even more striking, over 70% of those reports had originated from pilots or senior flight personnel. Bias wasn't an outlier. It was embedded into the daily rhythms of aviation culture. Marcus scheduled a meeting with the Airline Safety and Training Consortium. Their initial response was defensive. Representatives argued that security protocols left little room for subjective interpretation and that pilots were trained to err on the side of caution. But Marcus presented the data without commentary. The numbers spoke for themselves. By the end of the hour, the room had gone silent. We've trained our pilots to memorize checklists, emergency procedures, airspace regulations, he said. It's time we train them to check their bias with the same rigor. The proposal he submitted included annual live scenario evaluations, anonymous internal reporting systems with third-party oversight, and mandatory reporting of every incident involving law enforcement and passengers under 18. The industry would no longer operate under silence or self-policing. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted. Protests formed outside major airports demanding justice for Jameer and broader reforms across the travel industry. Celebrities, aviation unions, and advocacy groups issued statements. A former NASA astronaut publicly shared his own story of being stopped in an airport because a TSA agent didn't believe a black man could be carrying a government flight clearance. The FAA's inbox flooded with stories that echoed Marcus's concerns. He read them all. At home, Jameer began rebuilding his project. The new tablet had better video editing software, and with a bit of help from his dad, he started compiling footage. This time, it wasn't just planes taking off and landing. He added voiceover, his own. Calm, precise, with facts about each model and its role in aviation history. His dad offered feedback only when asked. He wanted Jameer to own this one fully. But the real turning point came when a national aviation magazine reached out, asking if Jameer would be willing to publish a short photo essay on aviation through his lens. The request wasn't for sympathy. They'd seen clips of his work and were impressed by the detail and narrative strength. Jameer was hesitant, but Marcus encouraged him. Your voice deserves to be in the skies too. The essay was titled Wings and Warnings, and it featured stills from airports across the country. The final photo was of a private jet, shadowed against dusk, with the caption, "I love planes. Just not the assumptions that come with watching them." The piece went viral overnight. Inside CalStar Airways, the fallout continued. Captain Harkness had hired legal representation, claiming reputational harm and wrongful suspension. But the internal investigation revealed a troubling pattern. He had reported suspicious behavior from passengers of color on 6 prior occasions. None resulted in any confirmed security threat. In one instance, he flagged a Latino teenager using a GoPro near a maintenance gate. He had been documenting a class field trip. When confronted with the findings, Harkness doubled down. He claimed he had followed procedure and that he was being punished for doing his job. The airline's board disagreed. His contract was terminated with cause. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about a record of habitual profiling masked as diligence. The story reached international media. Some conservative pundits criticized the decision, framing it as caving to political pressure. But within the aviation world, the message was clear. The cost of unexamined bias now carried real consequences. Marcus kept his focus on building. He greenlit funding for a new FAA-led initiative called Elevate: Equity in Leadership, Evaluation, Visibility, and Aviation Training Enterprise. Its first program, an outreach campaign to fund aviation mentorships for underrepresented youth. Jameer was listed as the honorary first participant. One of the key pillars of Elevate was embedding cultural and emotional intelligence into flight training. Not just once, but throughout every stage: initial certification, simulator assessments, and annual reviews. It would also offer anonymous peer-reviewed evaluations, allowing pilots to reflect on their behavioral patterns without public shaming. The idea wasn't punishment, it was growth. While industry heads debated logistics, Jameer's story was invited to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum's Diversity in Aviation exhibit. He attended the opening with his dad. Cameras flashed, but Jameer didn't shrink. He answered questions thoughtfully, never once playing the victim. "I just want people to look at kids like me and not see a threat," he said. "Just see someone who loves planes." Back in Washington, a new Senate bill was drafted with bipartisan support. It mandated implicit bias training for all federal transportation employees and tied airport funding to compliance with inclusive hiring practices. It wasn't a sweeping overhaul, but it was a beginning. Marcus didn't claim victory. He knew culture didn't shift overnight. But the gears had started turning. In a follow-up hearing, the FAA was lauded for its quick and firm response. When asked what he believed had changed, Marcus answered plainly, "We removed the luxury of silence." He didn't name-drop Jameer. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. In the months that followed, a surprising number of commercial pilots began speaking out in favor of the reforms. A retired Delta captain wrote an op-ed confessing how often he'd mistaken nervousness in young black men for guilt. "I thought I was protecting passengers. Turns out, I was protecting a worldview I never questioned." More airports implemented equity briefings as part of their daily operational check-ins. Pilots started self-reporting questionable incidents, asking for clarity and retraining instead of hiding mistake. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. At a private industry gala months later, Marcus was honored for excellence in transformational leadership. He accepted it with a brief nod. When asked by reporters how he wanted to be remembered in the industry, he said, "As the man who saw a boy with a camera and knew the problem wasn't him, but the lens we used to look at him." When the footage from Marcus's glasses hit the Senate Oversight Committee's internal servers, it triggered immediate deliberation. The video had been recorded legally, under FAA protocols for inspection transparency, and its contents left no room for ambiguity. The raw, uninterrupted clip showed a veteran airline captain falsely accusing a minor of acting suspiciously, and a swift police escalation based on nothing more than skin color and presence. The officer's body language, the tone of voice, the absence of questions before restraints, all of it painted a chilling picture of casual, institutionalized prejudice. Within 48 hours, the chair of the Senate Transportation Subcommittee demanded an emergency hearing on racial profiling in aviation. Marcus was invited not as a guest, but as the keynote witness. His credentials were unimpeachable, his position authoritative, and his personal tie to the incident undeniable. The moment was historic. Never before had the head of the FAA testified on a matter of racial justice born from his own lived experience. The hearing room was packed. Every news network ran live coverage. As Marcus took the microphone, he didn't speak from a place of vengeance. He spoke from clarity. "This isn't about one pilot, one airline, or one boy with a camera," he said. "It's about a system where suspicion grows in the absence of understanding, where presence equals threat because of complexion, where safety becomes a shield for bias." He played the video, uninterrupted. Senators leaned forward. Staffers whispered. Viewers at home sat in stunned silence. At the moment the police grabbed Jameer's wrist, several gasped aloud. But Marcus didn't offer commentary. He let the recording speak. Only after it ended did he continue. "This is what happens when we allow assumptions to fly first class and accountability to ride standby." He presented data from the FAA's internal reviews, the statistics on racial profiling in passenger reports, and the disciplinary loopholes exploited by senior flight crews to avoid consequences. He offered legislative suggestions. Federally mandated bias training, passenger advocacy protocols, and an independent complaint commission for aviation-related civil rights violations. But the most impactful moment came when he removed a folded piece of paper from his inner pocket and read aloud. It was a letter Jameer had written to him the night after the incident. "Dear Dad, I didn't think it would hurt that much. I thought I'd be okay because I didn't do anything wrong. But I wasn't okay. I was scared. Not just of the police, but that people will always see me like that. I love planes, but I don't love that feeling. I don't want to be afraid to love things. Jameer." Marcus didn't cry. His voice didn't tremble. He read it like a man who'd turned pain into resolve. When he finished, the chamber was silent for a full 10 seconds before the chairperson spoke. "Administrator Green, we will be submitting your recommendations for immediate bipartisan review." The next day, several news headlines echoed with variations of the same phrase. The FAA just grounded racism in aviation. Public response was overwhelming. Social media flooded with messages of support, testimonials from other parents, former flight attendants, and passengers who shared their own encounters with bias at airports. Some told of being forced to miss flights after being flagged for random searches repeatedly. Others spoke of being mistaken for staff simply because of their race. What was once whispered in frustration now rose in unified demand: change. Corporate stakeholders started to shift. A major airline announced the establishment of a chief equity officer position within its leadership, the first of its kind. Another restructured its training modules entirely, contracting third-party ethics firms to audit pilot behavior histories. Airline unions, once defensive, began to support Marcus's proposed oversight policies, framing them as tools for restoring public trust rather than mechanisms of punishment. Meanwhile, Jameer's school invited Marcus to speak during their Civil Leadership Week. He declined, suggesting instead that Jameer present his updated aviation project. The school agreed. When Jameer took the stage, he didn't mention the incident. He presented his video with enthusiasm, narrating the specs of each aircraft, explaining how lift worked, and pointing out the difference between commercial and cargo engines. He ended with a message: flying is about trust, and trust means we don't assume someone doesn't belong before we know who they are. His classmates gave him a standing ovation. Back at the FAA, Marcus initiated a new internal campaign titled Clear Skies, Clear Minds, promoting inclusivity not just in hiring but in how every passenger was treated, from TSA checks to gate interactions. Posters featuring diverse aviators were installed across terminals. Training videos featured real-life stories, not abstract hypotheticals. The message was consistent. Discrimination had no altitude where it would be ignored. But not everyone accepted the changes quietly. A coalition of retired pilots penned an open letter questioning the politicization of aviation. They argued that the focus on equity distracted from safety. Marcus responded in an op-ed published in the Aviation Standard: "Equity isn't a distraction. It's the foundation of ethical safety. When you assume threat without evidence, you create risk, not prevent it." The op-ed resonated far beyond the aviation industry. Universities used it in ethics classes. DI departments in unrelated sectors cited it during workshop. For many, Marcus had shifted the conversation from reactive diversity statements to proactive leadership. Senate hearings continued over the following months, but the tone had changed. What began as damage control had evolved into policy reform. Grants were issued for underrepresented youth to pursue flight school. The FAA established a mentorship program pairing retired pilots with aspiring aviators from marginalized communities. Jameer, now a symbol of both pain and progress, was featured on the cover of Youth in Aviation magazine with the caption, "The next generation will soar higher." Marcus didn't allow fame to distract him. Every initiative launched came with deadlines, metrics, and real enforcement. He refused to let reform stall in bureaucracy. When he was offered a national award for leadership in diversity, he accepted only under the condition that the award ceremony fund 5 aviation scholarships for students of color. By the time the fiscal year ended, the FAA had implemented all but 2 of Marcus's proposals. Congressional budget adjustments made room for the remaining initiative. His legacy was cemented not just through speeches, but through structural recalibration. He hadn't only responded to a crisis, he turned it into a cultural correction. And while detractors still grumbled in online forums and private networks, the narrative had shifted. Not just around Marcus. Around who was welcome in aviation. Around who got to be seen as innocent, curious, worthy. Around how authority figures were held accountable not only by superiors but by the people they swore to serve. Change had taken off. And for the first time in a long time, everyone was watching the skies with a new lens, not tinted by fear or suspicion, but sharpened by truth. The impact of Marcus's actions began to ripple beyond policy and politics. At major international airports across the country, subtle but powerful changes began taking shape. New signage emphasized traveler rights and anti-discrimination protocols. Airline staff underwent recurring, mandatory empathy training, not as a symbolic gesture but as part of their certification process. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew were reminded that safety and service started with fairness and respect. The airline involved in the incident quietly placed Captain Alden on leave, pending review. But what they hadn't anticipated was how quickly public pressure would mount. The story had gone viral, not just because of who Marcus was, but because so many people saw themselves or their children in Jameer. Parents demanded to know how often these incidents occurred and why they weren't reported. Pilots from marginalized communities stepped forward, revealing stories of being sidelined, talked down to, or accused of incompetence without basis. A cultural reckoning had begun. Faced with scrutiny, the airline couldn't simply wait for outrage to fade. Their CEO issued a formal apology, not just to Jameer and Marcus, but to passengers, staff, and the public. It was broadcast live, and it included a commitment to transparency and immediate collaboration with the FAA on all recommended reforms. Still, the gesture alone wasn't enough. The public demanded accountability. In an unprecedented move, Marcus created a real-time public tracker where citizens could monitor the FAA's progress on its diversity and inclusion initiative. Metrics like employee demographic breakdowns, reported incidents of bias, and disciplinary actions were made available and updated quarterly. It became a model for other federal agencies, even outside of transportation. The transparency not only built trust, it created a framework where silence could no longer protect the status quo. Marcus also partnered with civil rights organizations and aviation academies to launch Project Ascend, a mentorship and scholarship pipeline program specifically for Black and brown youth interested in aviation and aerospace. Dozens of major airlines and aviation companies pledged funding. Aerospace manufacturers offered internship. Retired pilots volunteered to teach flight simulations at inner-city schools. The industry had gone from defending itself to rebuilding itself. Jameer, still only a kid, found his world expanding in strange ways. He was now invited to speak at youth panels and aviation expos. Reporters asked for interviews. His story was taught in ethics and civics classes. But Marcus protected him fiercely. Let him be a kid, he'd tell media outlets. Still, Jameer had changed. He walked taller, spoke with more conviction, and saw his dreams with clearer eyes. His school project had turned into a movement, and he was aware of the responsibility it brought. At the same time, Marcus understood that real transformation meant addressing the culture behind the rules. He visited every major airline headquarters over the following months, meeting not just with executives, but with junior staff, baggage handlers, customer service agents, new flight school graduates. He asked them about their experiences, listened without interrupting, and took note. He heard stories of subtle exclusions, missed promotions, ignored reports, jokes that weren't supposed to be taken seriously. Every story added fuel to his mission. He wasn't just fixing a broken system, he was rebuilding the values behind it. As his efforts gained momentum, Marcus received a call from the president, offering him a higher national advisory role. He declined. His place, he said, was right where the change had begun. The FAA wasn't just his job anymore, it was his platform, his purpose. He vowed to stay until every policy he'd introduced was not only implemented, but embraced. Meanwhile, Captain Alden's disciplinary review concluded. The findings were conclusive. Racial bias influenced his actions. Though some called for permanent termination, Marcus insisted on a restorative justice approach. Alden was given the choice: resign quietly or participate in a rigorous rehabilitation program that included counseling, bias training, and speaking publicly about the incident. Surprisingly, Alden chose the latter. When he eventually appeared on a panel months later, Alden spoke with subdued humility. "I didn't see a boy with a camera," he admitted. "I saw a threat because I've been trained, consciously or not, to associate certain faces with danger. I was wrong. No amount of flight hours excuses that." His words didn't erase the harm, but they acknowledged it, and they showed that redemption, when rooted in truth, could coexist with accountability. Marcus's approach drew admiration across ideological lines. He wasn't a firebrand. He didn't posture or perform. He acted decisively, spoke plainly, and followed through. Even skeptics found themselves respecting the clarity of his leadership. He reminded the public that true change was not about dismantling systems for the sake of it, but evolving them to serve everyone equally. He made inclusion feel like a patriotic duty, not a political one. International bodies took notice. The European Union invited Marcus to consult on aviation equity standard. Several countries requested permission to translate and distribute the FAA's new diversity training modules. Jameer's story was now global, not just a story of injustice, but a blueprint for progress. At the heart of it all, Marcus stayed grounded. He kept his weekends sacred, spending them with Jameer at airshows, museums, and sometimes just tossing a football in the yard. "I don't want to fly so high I forget the ground I came from," he once told a colleague. It was never about power for him. It was about protection, about making the skies safer not just for flight, but for the people walking toward the gates. By the end of the year, data showed a measurable drop in passenger profiling reports and a spike in minority applications to flight schools. The skies were beginning to reflect the diversity of those who once only watched from below. There was still work to be done. Marcus never pretended otherwise, but the trajectory had changed. Jameer submitted his follow-up school project with a new title, How My Dad Made Flying Fair. It didn't need graphs or dramatic music. Just a story. Just truth. Just a future where kids like him wouldn't be mistaken for a problem when they were only trying to learn. As Marcus watched his son present it to the class, he knew something deeper had shifted. Not just in the world, but in Jameer's eyes. The fear had been replaced with pride. The hurt had become history. And the future, that belonged to them both. The Senate chamber was silent as the hearing resumed. Every camera was pointed toward Marcus, and every senator leaned forward. His calm demeanor masked the pressure he carried. Behind him, screens displayed timestamps, policy failures, and civil complaints dating back a decade. The video of the airport incident hadn't just been a tool, it had become evidence of a cultural rot in aviation oversight, one that too many had ignored. Marcus began not with outrage, but with facts. He laid out the data: racial disparities in passenger targeting, hiring gaps among pilots and air traffic controllers, and the shocking lack of minority representation in aviation leadership. He referenced Jameer's experience not as an isolated case, but as a snapshot of systemic neglect. With every sentence, he built a bridge between anecdote and pattern, emotion and proof. Lawmakers, some of whom had never cared deeply about equity in aviation, suddenly found themselves without rebuttal. He proposed legislation: mandatory racial bias audits for all commercial airlines, a federal oversight board with teeth, and annual public reporting on diversity metric. Some senators pushed back, citing budgetary concerns or questioning the need. Marcus didn't flinch. You cannot claim to care about security while allowing fear to masquerade as protocol, he said. This isn't about being politically correct, it's about being professionally competent. The hearing, streamed live, attracted millions. Social media exploded with commentary, not just on the issue, but on Marcus's unwavering clarity. Civil rights leaders praised his composure. Aviation professionals, many of whom had long felt silenced, felt seen. The industry's front-facing politeness had been peeled back, and what remained was an urgent call to conscience. Marcus's testimony didn't just ignite debate, it galvanized a coalition. A bipartisan group of senators agreed to sponsor his proposed legislation. Civil society groups launched advocacy campaigns. Schools began hosting equity in aviation awareness days, using Jameer's story as curriculum. What began as one father's confrontation with injustice had evolved into a generational shift. But Marcus knew public momentum could be fleeting. He followed up relentlessly, hosting strategy sessions, speaking at universities, and meeting with union leaders and airline CEOs. He made it clear: compliance wouldn't be enough. Real change meant transformation, starting at the top. The FAA, under his leadership, introduced a first-of-its-kind equity directorate. Staffed with independent investigators, cultural analysts, and ethics officers, its purpose was simple: track, measure, and correct bias. Unlike past committees, this one had the authority to ground aircraft, revoke licenses, and fine companies failing to meet equity benchmarks. Resistance was expected. Results weren't optional. Within 6 months, 2 major carriers had been fined for failing to report incidents of racial profiling. Another was forced to restructure its hiring process after a pattern of nepotism was uncovered. These weren't symbolic actions, they were consequences. Industry executives, once comfortable offering vague support, now found themselves scrambling to meet enforceable expectations. Amid the policy grind, Marcus never lost sight of the human side. He scheduled regular town halls with frontline employees, those most often ignored. In one session, a Latina gate agent shared how she was constantly second-guessed by older pilots. In another, a Sikh baggage handler spoke about repeated, random security checks. Each story deepened Marcus's resolve. These weren't statistical blips, they were lives. He also doubled down on mentorship. Every FAA regional office launched apprenticeship programs, pairing seasoned professionals with students from underserved communities. Scholarships flowed in from the private sector. For the first time, inner-city youth saw aviation as a real career path, not just a distant dream. It wasn't charity, it was investment. The pushback wasn't subtle. Anonymous threats landed in Marcus's inbox. Industry veterans whispered that he was turning the FAA into a political stage. But Marcus never responded with anger. He responded with numbers. Airlines showing improved safety ratings after diversity training, workforce retention climbing when inclusion became standard, and community trust surging when accountability was enforced. He was also strategic. Instead of isolating dissenters, he invited them into the process. Skeptical airline executives were asked to co-author policy revisions. Resistant pilot unions were given leadership roles in educational programs. Marcus understood that transformation without inclusion would only breed new resentment. Change, to be lasting, had to be shared. International interest grew. Aviation regulators in Canada, Brazil, and South Africa requested collaborative framework. Marcus hosted global equity summits, turning what was once a domestic concern into an international movement. Airports began redesigning signage, rethinking security training, and diversifying their leadership. The ripple effects were undeniable. Jameer, watching all of this unfold, remained quiet. He no longer felt like a kid caught in the middle of something bigger than him. Now, he felt like the catalyst of something just beginning. At school, he founded an aviation club. When asked why, he said simply, "I just want everyone to fly without fear." His clarity reflected his father's, but his mission was his own. Despite the progress, Marcus knew his work was far from done. There were still gatekeepers protecting outdated norms, still corners of the industry clinging to unspoken biases. But the narrative had shifted. Discrimination was no longer a silent fact, it was a public disgrace. And the country, led by policy and example, was less willing to look away. Legacy became a quiet presence in Marcus's mind. Not in the self-glorifying sense, but in the practical one. He began documenting his work, not as a memoir, but as a blueprint for future leaders, educators, and reformers. His notes were meticulous. What worked, what failed, who resisted, and who rose to the occasion. He called the project Windshear, a metaphor for turbulent change. One night, while preparing briefing notes, Marcus paused to watch Jameer sleep. The boy who had once been viewed as a threat for holding a camera was now the face of reform. He hadn't asked for this, but he'd handled it with grace beyond his years. Marcus felt a quiet pride, not for the recognition, but for having stayed true to his principles. As dawn broke, Marcus finalized a final set of recommendations. Among them was a mandate. Every new FAA leader would undergo mentorship training, not just technical onboarding. Leadership, he believed, wasn't about expertise alone, it was about humanity. You couldn't manage an industry you didn't understand at the most personal level. When he submitted the proposal the next morning, his assistant asked if he thought the board would approve it. Marcus smiled. "Eventually," he said. "Truth takes longer to land, but it always finds the runway." The country continued watching, learning, and adjusting. But no one would ever forget the moment a boy with a school project made an entire industry confront its prejudice, and the father who refused to let silence win. By the time the final vote was cast on the proposed legislative changes, the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The Senate was no longer debating whether change was needed, but how fast it could be enacted. The reality of the new policies wasn't just an exercise in political correctness, it was about securing a future where the systemic issues that had festered for decades could be confronted head-on. Marcus sat at his desk, going over the final draft of the policies that would reshape the FAA. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jameer, now a teenager, walked in with a familiar grin on his face. "Dad, are you still going to talk at that event tonight? I heard they're going to give you an award or something," Jameer asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and pride. Marcus looked up, not with the weight of a father who was simply proud of his son's accomplishments, but as someone who realized how far they'd come together. Jameer had not just been the catalyst for change. He had inspired a movement that was bigger than both of them. "Yeah, I'll be there," Marcus replied, smiling softly. "But the real work begins after tonight." The event was a ceremonial acknowledgement of the legislative progress they had made, a brief moment of victory before returning to the battlefield of real-world implementation. As much as the recognition mattered, Marcus knew that the people who had been hurt by systemic discrimination, the ones who had not seen the kind of progress they were now promising, would be the ones keeping him accountable moving forward. The room where the ceremony took place was filled with influential figures from the aviation world, some who had once dismissed Marcus's approach as too radical, others who had supported him all along. The applause when Marcus took the stage was loud, but muted by the reality that this moment, though hard one, was just the beginning. Standing at the podium, Marcus addressed the crowd with the calm authority that had become his trademark. "Thank you for your support," he began, his voice steady, yet filled with the weight of years of struggle. "But let's be clear, we are not here to congratulate ourselves. This moment is for those who came before us, who fought for fairness but never saw it. This moment is for every young person who will look at aviation not as an exclusive industry but as a place where they can thrive." His words resonated in the room. Those who had underestimated him, who thought his drive would dissipate once the policy changes had been passed, were now forced to reckon with the tangible results of his leadership. They knew that Marcus's impact was far from over, and that this award, though a recognition of his achievements, was also a signal that more work lay ahead. As the evening wound down, Marcus was approached by the head of a major airline, a man who had once been a vocal critic of the FAA's new policies. "I'll be the first to admit," the executive said, shaking Marcus's hand, "I was wrong. You've pushed this industry in ways I didn't think were possible. The next step is for us to continue this work and make sure it's real, not just on paper." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the shift in tone, but he wasn't about to let the man off the hook. "Real change doesn't come from acknowledgement," he said. "It comes from action. You want to be part of this? Then hold your company to the same standards you're now endorsing in public. We can't have corporations signing on to diversity initiatives while allowing discrimination to persist behind the scenes." The man looked taken aback, but nodded again. It was a start. For Marcus, it was never about public relations. It was about dismantling the practices that had allowed bias to thrive in the first place. The acknowledgement was nice, but he knew it meant little unless every leader in aviation, from the cockpit to the boardroom, was committed to genuine, transformative change. Later that evening, Marcus and Jameer sat together, enjoying a quiet dinner. The weight of the day had not worn off, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that their efforts were making an undeniable impact. Jameer, who had long been Marcus's quiet supporter, spoke up. "Dad, what's next for us?" he asked, clearly eager to understand the long-term vision. Marcus thought for a moment. "We keep going. This is a long game. We've made a lot of progress, but we can't stop here. The next step is to make sure the changes we've set in motion are sustained. We need to build pathways for the next generation of aviation leaders. The policies we've put in place will only succeed if we continue to hold people accountable, and that means all of us." Jameer nodded, understanding the enormity of the task ahead. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of resilience, of the same quiet strength that had driven his father. He wasn't just the son of a man who had changed the system. He was part of that change. And that, more than any award or recognition, was what truly mattered. In the days that followed, Marcus continued to meet with industry leaders, lawmakers, and civil rights advocates, pushing the agenda for broader change. His schedule was packed with speaking engagements, policy briefings, and closed-door meetings where difficult conversations about bias and accountability continued to unfold. Yet through it all, Marcus remained grounded. He never allowed the spotlight to cloud his vision. The work was ongoing, and he knew that while the moment of change had arrived, its full impact was still in the making. For Jameer, the transition from a boy who had been the target of suspicion to a young man who was now seen as a leader in his own right was both surreal and inspiring. He used his voice to speak out on behalf of those who couldn't be heard, advocating for fairness in every arena of his life. He wasn't just the son of the FAA administrator. He was an advocate, a mentor, and a symbol of what could happen when systems were challenged and changed from within. And so, the battle continued, not in the halls of Congress, but on the ground where real change occurred. Marcus's work had begun a ripple effect, and that ripple was expanding. His vision of a diverse, inclusive aviation industry was becoming more than a goal, it was becoming the new standard. The journey was far from over, but Marcus and Jameer knew that the future, for the first time in a long while, looked different. And that difference was the promise of equality, accountability, and a future built on a foundation of empathy and resilience.